Sydney's rental vacancy rate has fallen to 1.1%, the lowest in over a decade. 80 prospective tenants are now lining up around the block for a single one-bedroom apartment. Rents have hit a ceiling, but the queues have not shrunk. The question no one is answering: if renters cannot afford to stay and cannot afford to leave, where do they go? If you're trying to rent in Sydney right now and you cannot understand why you keep missing out, this one is for you. Stick around. Welcome to Sydney Housing Collapse. Here's what nobody is telling you about Sydney's rental crisis. You have seen the headlines: record rents, record queues, record desperation. But nobody is connecting the three forces that turn Sydney's rental market into a system designed to fail you. This is what we are going to break down. Section 1. The queue. Why 80 people are fighting for one property, and why submitting a strong application no longer matters. Section 2. The rollover trap. The hidden rent increase that hits you not when you move in, but when your lease ends, and why landlords are banking on it. Section 3. The exodus. Where Sydney renters actually go when they are priced out, and what happens to the suburbs they land in. Each of these forces feeds the next. The queue creates the desperation. The desperation enables the rollover trap. The rollover trap triggers the exodus, and the exodus makes the queue even longer in the suburbs people flee to. Now, here is the number that holds this entire story together. SQM Research reports that Sydney lost 943 available rental properties in the last 12 months, while adding thousands of new renters who were pushed out of the buying market by the RBA's rate hikes. 943 fewer homes, thousands more people searching. Let that number sit for a moment. Actually, let me put it differently, because 943 sounds like a statistic, and statistics are easy to ignore. SQM Research measured Sydney's rental vacancy rate in April of this year at 1.1%. A year ago, it was 1.3%. That does not sound like a big move. 0.2 of a percentage point. But those 0.2 represent 943 actual homes that were available to rent 12 months ago and are no longer on the market today. A balanced rental market, the kind where tenants have genuine choice and landlords compete for good renters, sits at 3% vacancy. Sydney is at 1.1. That is not tight. That is structural failure. What does 1.1% feel like on a Saturday morning? It feels like this. You wake up at 7. You check domain. A one-bedroom apartment in Surrey Hills has been listed overnight $885 a week. You book the inspection for 11. You arrive at 10:45 because you know. And there are already 40 people ahead of you. By the time the agent opens the door, the queue stretches around the corner. 80 people. For one apartment. Meet Sarah. She is 31, works in marketing in the CBD, earns $92,000 a year before tax. By most standards, she is doing well. She has been looking for a rental for 11 weeks. She has attended 23 inspections. She has submitted 19 applications, each one with payslips, references, a rental ledger, a cover letter. She has been approved for none of them. "I do not know what else I can do," she told a reporter. "I have a clean record. I earn good money. I offer to pay months in advance." But there are always 30 or 40 other people offering the same thing. It is not about being good enough anymore. It is about being the best out of 80. Sarah is not an edge case. She is the market. So how did we get here? A city where a person earning $92,000 a year cannot secure a place to live. Section 1. The queue. Why 80 people line up for one home. The queue did not appear out of nowhere. It was built, layer by layer, over 3 years of compounding pressure. Start with supply. SQM Research shows Sydney's vacancy rate dropped from 1.3% to 1.1% in 12 months. But that headline conceals a geographic trap. The inner ring Surrey Hills, Newtown, Glebe, Darlinghurst sits at 2.4% vacancy, according to SQM Research and Urban Renters Agent. The middle ring is tighter at 1.8%. That means the further you move from the city center, the harder it gets, the exact opposite of what most people assume. In those inner suburbs, properties receive applications within hours of listing. Urban Renters Agent and Aurora Property NSW report that rentals in Surrey Hills, Newtown, and Glebe are typically leased within 48 hours. If you do not have a complete application ready to submit at the inspection, payslips, references, identification, rental history, you are locked out before the agent even reads your name. Meet James. He is 27, a junior architect living in a share house in Marrickville. His lease ends in 6 weeks. He has attended 14 inspections in 3 weeks. At the last one, the agent told him there were 32 applications for a studio apartment at $760 a week. The agent looked at me and said, "Look, mate, you're qualified, but so is everyone else. It is a numbers game now. A numbers game for a place to sleep." Now, here is what the other side says, and it is worth hearing. Property managers argue that low vacancy is a sign of high demand for Sydney, which reflects the city's desirability. They point out that migration is strong, employment is strong, and people want to live here. They are not wrong about the demand, but they are silent about the supply. The Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that Sydney's population grew by over 100,000 in the year to June 2025. In the same period, the NSW Building Commission approved fewer new dwellings than in any year since 2012. Demand surged. Supply froze. The queue is not a symptom of popularity. It is a symptom of failure to build. 80 people in a queue is not a market. It is a lottery with no winner's guarantee. Section 2. The rollover trap. The rent rise nobody budgets for. You survived the queue. You got the apartment. You signed a 12-month lease at $800 a week. For 1 year, you are safe. Your rent is locked. You can plan. And then the lease ends. SQM Research and Property Investment Professionals report that landlords in Sydney are now advertising new rental stock at an average of $1,156 a week for houses. Tenants who signed 12-month leases in 2024 are paying around $800 a week. The gap between what you are paying and what your landlord could charge a new tenant is $356 a week. That gap has a name. It is called the rollover gap, and it is the mechanism that traps renters in Sydney more effectively than any lease clause ever could. Here is how it works. Your lease expires. Your landlord has 2 choices. They can renew your lease at a modest increase, say $30 or $40 a week, and keep a reliable tenant. Or they can let you go, relist the property at the current market rate, and collect $356 more every single week from a new tenant. Per year, that is $18,512 in additional rent. Which do you think they choose? Meet Priya. She is 34, a teacher in Randwick. She signed her lease in March 2024 at $770 a week for a 2-bedroom unit. Her landlord just offered to renew at $950 a week, a 23% increase. Priya cannot afford it, but she also cannot afford to move because everything else on the market is listed at $1,000 or more. "I did the maths at 3 in the morning," she said. "If I stay, I lose $230 a week I do not have. If I leave, I pay even more somewhere else and spend $2,000 on removalists and bond. There is no good option. There is only the least bad one." This is market analysis, only not financial advice. Always speak to a qualified professional before making any property decisions. The counter-argument here is reasonable. Landlords face rising costs. 2 mortgage repayments have surged since the RBA lifted the cash rate to 4.35%. Insurance, strata, maintenance, all up. They need higher rent to cover their position. That is fair to acknowledge. But here is the data that dismantles it. Domain's Chief of Research, Dr. Nicola Powell, described Sydney's rental market in April 2026 as a market that has hit a ceiling. Rents are at record highs, but they are no longer rising. Renters have hit their limit. They have become much more price sensitive. The landlord's costs are real, but the renter's capacity to absorb them is exhausted. When the ceiling holds but the floor keeps dropping, the person standing in the middle gets crushed. The rollover trap is not a market correction. It is a wealth transfer from people who rent to people who own. Section 3. The Exodus, where renters go when they cannot stay. So what happens when the queue defeats you and the rollover trap prices you out? You leave. Not Sydney entirely, not yet. But you move. Further out. Smaller place. Different arrangement. Domain's March quarter 2026 report documents the pattern. Renters are moving further from city centers. They are switching from houses to units. They are moving back in with family. They are doubling up in share houses they thought they had outgrown. This is not downsizing by choice. This is retreat. And the retreat has a geography. When renters are priced out of Newtown, they move to Marrickville. When Marrickville gets too expensive, they push to Canterbury. When Canterbury tightens, they go to Bankstown. Each wave of displacement pushes the pressure outward, and when it arrives, it brings the queue with it. Meet Daniel. He is 29, a paramedic. He lived in Erskineville for 4 years. When his lease came up for renewal, his landlord raised the rent by $180 a week. He could not match it. He now commutes from Campbelltown 90 minutes each way by train. I did not leave Erskineville because I wanted to, he said. I left because the rent decided for me. Now I spend 3 hours a day on a train. That is 15 hours a week I used to spend living my life. The industry response to this is predictable. Build more, increase density, fast-track approvals, and in principle, they are right. Supply is part of the answer. But the RBA's decision in May 2026 to hold the cash rate at 4.35% did something the supply argument cannot fix. It reduced borrowing capacity, which means people who would have bought are now stuck renting. Every would-be buyer who remains a renter adds one more body to the queue. You cannot build your way out of a crisis when monetary policy keeps feeding people into it. The exodus does not solve the crisis, it spreads it. Sydney is not the only city where renters queue around the block. But the scale here is unlike almost anywhere else in the developed world. Take Melbourne first. Domain reports Melbourne's median house rent at $550 a week, $250 less than Sydney's $800. SQM Research puts Melbourne's vacancy rate at 1.7%, significantly more breathing room than Sydney's 1.1%. Melbourne renters face pressure. Sydney renters face a wall. Now look at Auckland. New Zealand's largest city went through its own rental crisis between 2021 and 2023. But Auckland responded with aggressive zoning reform, allowing more density across the city. The result, according to multiple housing researchers, was a measurable increase in supply and a stabilization of rents that Sydney has not achieved. Vancouver tells a different story again. Canada's Pacific Coast city introduced vacancy taxes, rent caps, and tenant protection laws. Rent still rose, but the rate of increase slowed and the displacement pattern was less severe. Vancouver chose to intervene. Sydney chose to wait. In every comparable city, the pattern is the same. When supply fails to keep pace with demand and policy does not intervene, renters absorb the entire cost. The difference is what governments do about it. Melbourne has more room. Auckland built its way toward relief. Vancouver regulated. Sydney did none of these things, and its renters are paying the price in queues that stretch around corners and leases they can no longer afford to renew. So, where does this go from here? 3 scenarios, not predictions, but possibilities grounded in the data we have right now. Best case. The RBA cuts the cash rate twice before the end of 2026, restoring enough borrowing capacity to pull a portion of renters back into the buying market. NSW accelerates dwelling approvals, and new stock begins reaching the market by mid-2027. Vacancy edges up toward 1.5%. Rents stabilize, but do not fall. The queue shrinks from 80 to 40. Renters still compete, but with better odds. This is the best case. and it still means record rents, fierce competition, and no relief for anyone earning below the median income. Realistic case. The RBA holds the cash rate at 4.35% through 2026. Supply remains constrained. Population growth continues at its current pace. Vacancy stays at or below 1.2%. Domain's forecast plays out. Median house rents reach $815 a week, and unit rents reach $792. The rollover gap widens. The exodus accelerates. Renters adjust by absorbing more cost, shrinking their living space, or leaving Sydney altogether. The queue stays at 60 to 80 people per inspection in desirable suburbs. This is the most likely path, and it is the one you should plan for. Worst case. A global economic shock triggers job losses in Sydney's services sector while migration inflows continue. The RBA cannot cut rates because inflation remains sticky. Vacancy drops below 1%. Homelessness services report a surge in working Australians seeking assistance for the first time. The rollover gap becomes untenable for a significant portion of tenants. Rental stress, defined as spending more than 30% of income on housing, becomes the norm rather than the exception. This is not speculation. Every element of this scenario already has a data point behind it. So, what do you actually do with all of this? If you are a current mortgage holder, your position is stronger than you think. You own in a market where renters are desperate to become buyers. But do not ignore the RBA's trajectory. If rates hold, your repayments hold. If rates drop, your equity grows. Lock in your budget now, stress test it at the current rate, and do not assume a cut is coming. If you are a first home buyer, the queue is your competition, but it is also your signal. Every person in that queue is a renter who would buy if they could. When borrowing capacity returns, and it will, eventually demand will spike. Use this window to build your deposit and get your pre-approval paperwork ready so you can move the moment conditions shift. If you are a renter, know your rights on lease renewal increases. Prepare your application package before you start looking, not after. Target the middle ring where vacancy is slightly higher at 1.8% rather than the inner ring at 2.4%. And if your lease is ending in 2026, start looking now, not 4 weeks before expiry. The 48-hour leasing window in inner suburbs means late starters are locked out. If you are an investor, the rollover gap is real, and it is widening. But Dr. Nicola Powell's ceiling warning is also real. Renters are tapped out. Pushing rents beyond what the market can absorb leads to longer vacancies and higher turnover costs. Price to retain, not to extract. 3 numbers tell this entire story. 1.1% Sydney's vacancy rate, 943 fewer homes available to rent than 12 months ago. $356, the weekly rollover gap between what existing tenants pay and what landlords can charge a new renter, a gap that turns every lease renewal into a financial crisis. 80, the number of people who showed up to inspect a single one-bedroom apartment in Surrey Hills, each one qualified, each one desperate, and all but one of them walking away with nothing. Sydney's rental market is no longer a market. It is a queue with no end. Subscribe to Sydney Housing Collapse new analysis every week. No agents, no spin, just the data.